The woman they buried alive. She gave him everything. He gave her back nothing but a signature and a smirk. But the moment that pen left the paper, Grant Holloway made the worst mistake of his life. Because the quiet woman he just threw away in open court wasn't just his wife. She was the heir to the most feared criminal dynasty in America, and she'd been hiding it from him for 8 years. If this story hits you where it counts, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the end. You won't see this coming. The courtroom smelled like money and cruelty, which in Manhattan was basically the same thing. Grant Holloway sat at the plaintiff's table with his jacket pressed so sharp it could cut glass, one hand resting flat on the oak surface, the other curled around a glass of water he hadn't touched. 41 years old, 6 feet even, the kind of jaw that photographed well, and a smile he'd learned to weaponize before he turned 30. He looked like someone who had never, not once in his adult life, been told no by anyone who mattered. Serena sat across the aisle. She wore a gray dress that had been laundered so many times the fabric had gone soft at the elbows. No jewelry except the thin gold wedding band she hadn't removed yet. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She looked like a woman who had packed light for a long trip and wasn't quite sure where she was going when it ended. She wasn't looking at Grant. She was looking at a point somewhere past his left shoulder, past the mahogany paneling, past the tall windows streaked with October rain, past the line of high-rises beyond that. Like she was watching something the rest of them couldn't see. Grant noticed. He always noticed things he could use. The judge was saying something about mutual dissolution of marital assets. The attorneys were nodding. Outside, 22 floors below, Midtown moved the way it always did, loud and indifferent and entirely unaware that Grant Holloway was about to make the cleanest exit of his life. He thought about Camille, the way she looked standing in the kitchen of his Tribeca penthouse at 7 in the morning in his shirt and nothing else, laughing at something on her phone. 29, former model, currently the managing partner of a boutique PR firm that had landed 3 Fortune 500 accounts in 18 months. She was sharp, and she was beautiful, and she wanted the same things he did, which was everything and fast. Serena had never wanted the same things he did. That was the problem, start to finish. He told his attorney, Marcus Ewan, third-generation Columbia law, $900 an hour. He'd told Marcus a month ago she married the wrong man and she knows it. She wanted someone who'd come home at 6 and watch movies on a Tuesday. Someone soft. I built something. I needed a partner who could keep up. Marcus had nodded like he was supposed to and said nothing useful. The judge asked them to confirm their consent to the terms. Serena's attorney, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses named Phyllis, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire proceedings, touched Serena's arm once, gently. Serena nodded. Grant said yes without waiting to be asked twice. When the gavel came down, he exhaled. It was that clean. 8 years of marriage ended with a sound like a door closing in an empty hallway. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and turned toward Serena because he'd promised himself he wouldn't be petty. And then he was petty anyway, because he always was when he felt the particular combination of triumph and contempt that he confused for confidence. Take care of yourself, Serena. He said it the way you say it to someone you've already forgotten. I hope you find something, something you're good at. She looked at him then. Her eyes were the color of dark water, steady and unreadable, and for a moment, just a moment, something moved behind them that he couldn't name. Not hurt, not anger. Something older than either of those things. I already have, she said. Then she picked up the worn leather handbag from the seat beside her, slid the wedding band from her finger without looking at it, and set it on the table. She didn't drop it. She placed it, deliberately, like a period at the end of a sentence she'd spent 8 years composing. She walked toward the doors. Grant watched her go because the exit struck him as oddly graceful, and he didn't know what to do with that, so he decided it meant nothing. Marcus appeared at his elbow. Cars downstairs, Camille called twice. Tell her 20 minutes. Also the Hargrove account. 20 minutes, Marcus. He was still watching the doors Serena had passed through when the first sound reached them from outside. It was low at first, a rumble that you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears, the kind of vibration that didn't belong to city noise, not traffic, not construction, not the distant complaint of subway lines beneath the concrete. This was something deliberate and organized and moving. Someone at the window said, "What the hell is that?" Grant crossed to the glass. 22 floors below, West Street had gone still in a way Manhattan never went still. 6 black SUVs, armored, he could tell by the way they sat low and heavy despite their size, had formed a loose perimeter around the courthouse entrance with the precision of a military exercise. Not police. No lights, no markings, no insignia of any kind. The vehicles were identical, matte black running plates he couldn't read from this height. Men in dark suits had deployed from each vehicle and positioned themselves along the sidewalk in 2 parallel lines that extended from the courthouse steps to the edge of the block. Not standing, positioned. Hands clasped behind their backs, facing inward, forming a corridor that led directly to a runway. The executive airstrip at Pier 57 was 3 blocks south, a private facility Grant had used a dozen times. And descending toward it right now, in a shallow arc that brought it low enough to catch the October light and throw it back like a signal, was a jet. Not a standard private aircraft. This thing was gold. Not gold-colored, not gold-trimmed, gold-plated. The kind of absurd total commitment to excess that announced itself as a statement rather than a preference. It moved like wealth so dense it had developed its own gravity, and the sound of its engines hit the courthouse windows a second after they all registered what they were seeing. "That's not a commercial approach," someone said behind Grant. "No," he said, "it's not." The aircraft touched down with unlikely grace and taxied to a stop at the edge of the executive runway. The door unsealed, steps deployed. And from the building exit 22 floors below, moving at an unhurried pace that somehow suggested absolute authority, Serena walked out. The men in dark suits turned inward as she passed through them. One by one, beginning at the entrance and moving outward toward the jet, they bowed. Not a professional nod, not a respectful inclination of the head, a full bow, from the waist. Grant pressed his hand to the glass. A figure descended the jet's steps. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned long ago that the world would wait for him. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, and even from this height and distance, there was something in the way he carried himself that made Grant's stomach do something unfamiliar. The man reached the bottom of the steps and stopped. Serena walked the length of the corridor her guards had made for her and stopped 6 feet away. The silver-haired man opened his arms. Serena hesitated. That was the thing that Grant couldn't get past later, the hesitation, as though this moment cost her something even as it returned something else. And then she walked into the embrace. Grant heard nothing from up here, but he watched the silver-haired man pull back, take Serena by the face, study her the way you study someone you haven't seen in much too long and are afraid of losing again. And then the man said something, 2 words, maybe 3. Whatever they were, they made Serena close her eyes. Marcus said very quietly, "Grant, who is that?" Grant didn't answer. His mouth had gone dry. One of the other attorneys had a phone out, pulling something up fast. He turned the screen around without a word. The search result loaded to a photo first. The silver-haired man, younger by maybe a decade, standing behind a podium at some kind of financial conference. The caption below identified him. Lucien Moretti. The name didn't need explanation in any room that contained men who had spent careers inside the architecture of money and power in this city. Lucien Moretti was 63 years old, the only surviving son of the late Aldo Moretti, and the public face of the Moretti Group, a holding company with legitimate interests in shipping, private equity, and commercial real estate that collectively represented a portfolio valued north of $40 billion. He sat on the boards of 3 major financial institutions and had been photographed with 2 sitting presidents and a prime minister. He was also, if you believed the things that got said in quiet rooms and never in print, the architect of the most sophisticated and durable organized criminal infrastructure in the country's history. The Moretti family had existed in some form since the 1920s, had survived every attempt to dismantle it through prosecution, rival violence, and internal fragmentation, and had expanded during the years when everyone assumed it was contracting. Their operations were rumored to span 6 continents. Their legal representation occupied an entire floor of a midtown skyscraper. Nobody had ever made a charge stick. And Lucien Moretti was standing on a private runway calling Serena, his Serena, the woman who ironed her own clothes and drove a 10-year-old Volvo and cried at nature documentaries, but by a name that wasn't Serena Vale. He called her by her family name, and the name he used was Moretti. Grant's hand slid off the glass. The corridor of suited men was moving now, forming a protective shell around the two figures as they walked back toward the jet. Two of them closed in precisely at Serena's position, flanking her without touching her, their posture shifting into something that wasn't escort. It was guard. Serious and practiced and absolute. Serena did not look up at the courthouse. She didn't look back. The jet door sealed behind her. The steps retracted. Within 4 minutes, the aircraft had taxied back onto the runway, and the engines had risen to a pitch that pressed against the city's ambient noise and won. The SUVs were already gone. The corridor of men had dissolved. West Street had resumed its ordinary chaos as though nothing had interrupted it, as though the last 10 minutes had been edited out of the city's experience cleanly and without trace. Marcus said, "Grant." "Don't," Grant said. "You need to—" "I said don't." He was still looking at the runway. The jet was lifting now, catching the low afternoon light on its plating and throwing it back in fragments. He watched it until the angle changed and it became just a shape against the cloud cover, and then until that shape was gone. 8 years. He had shared a bed with her for 8 years. He had eaten breakfast across a table from her. He had watched her worry about grocery costs while he was negotiating 9-figure deals. He had decided somewhere around year 4 that she was simply limited, that her quietness was smallness, that her contentment was an absence of ambition, that she was the kind of woman who would always be a footnote in someone else's story. Lucien Moretti had just called her daughter, not daughter-in-law, not like a family friend. The way he'd said it, Grant hadn't heard the word, but he'd watched the shape of it, was the way you say a name that belongs to you, that you've been holding. Grant sat down. The chair caught him. He was grateful for it. He didn't know yet what he'd lost. He didn't know yet the shape or scale of it, but something in the base of his chest had gone cold, and the cold was spreading, and it didn't feel like surprise. It felt like consequence. What he also didn't know, what he wouldn't learn for another 3 days, when his attorney would call him at 11 at night with a voice that had gone strange and flat, was that by the time Serena's gold-plated jet had climbed above the Manhattan skyline, every financial model Grant Holloway had used to build his corporation over the last 6 years had already been traced to its origin. Every algorithm, every market analysis, every position prediction that had made him look like a visionary in rooms full of people desperate to believe in visionaries. Every one of them had begun, in draft form, in a leather-bound notebook that Serena kept in the third drawer of a desk in the home office she was no longer allowed to use. He had never asked her what she did in there. He had never thought to ask. She was just Serena, quiet, capable of nothing that mattered, the woman who never accomplished anything. The thought came back to him now, his own words said in front of a courtroom full of people, and he had said them with such ease, and it sat in his stomach like something swallowed wrong. He'd meant it to be a clean cut, final, the kind of ending you walk away from without looking back. What he didn't know, sitting in that emptying courtroom while the rain moved down the windows and the city carried on without him, was that Serena Vale, born Serena Moretti, daughter of the most dangerous family in the country, had not yet begun. And that by the time she did, the word accomplished would never be the same for him again. 3 days later, at 11:47 on a Thursday night, Grant's phone lit up with Marcus's name. He answered on the second ring. Marcus said, "There's something you need to see." The something was a folder, 46 pages, delivered by courier within the hour, sitting now on Grant's kitchen island under the hard overhead light, while he stood in his undershirt and read. Camille had gone to bed. The city outside was doing its usual restless thing. The espresso machine ticked as it cooled. The folder was a financial forensic audit, not the kind ordered by a court, the kind commissioned by someone with access to the kind of resources that could move quietly and fast. It had been compiled by a firm Grant had never heard of, with offices in 3 countries, and its findings were precise in the way that precision is wielded as a weapon. Page 1 was a summary. 9 words at the top. Origin analysis. Holloway Financial Group, primary analytical assets, 2018 to 2024. Grant read it standing up. He didn't sit down. He didn't have the cognition to spare for finding a chair. The audit had traced the genesis of 43 proprietary financial models, the intellectual core of his firm, the instruments that had generated returns extraordinary enough to be written about in trade publications, to be cited in business school curricula, to make Grant Holloway's name synonymous in certain circles with the word genius, back to handwritten drafts. Photographs of those drafts were included in the appendix. The handwriting was unmistakable. He'd watched her write in that notebook for years, on Sunday mornings, at the kitchen table, sometimes in the back seat of cars on long drives when she'd say she was making lists. He'd assumed grocery lists. He had never asked. The methodology notes were in her hand. The original variable structures were in her hand. The risk calibration frameworks, the sector rotation logic, the volatility hedging sequences that his quants had spent months building into executable code, all of it, every foundational idea traced back to Serena's notebook. His quants had never known where the seed concepts came from. Grant had fed the ideas to them incrementally, reframed as his own thinking. His team was extraordinary at execution. They had never questioned the source because brilliant ideas coming from the CEO were exactly what they expected. He put the folder down. He picked it up again. He read the last page twice, which contained a single paragraph that Marcus had highlighted in yellow. The intellectual property documented herein was generated entirely by S. Morettivale between the years 2016 and 2023. Under existing statutes governing marital intellectual property and the precedents established in 3 comparable jurisdictions, this material may constitute grounds for civil recovery proceedings with a potential liability exposure estimated between $340 million and $1.2 billion, depending on damages. Calculation methodology selected. Grant set the folder down. The espresso machine had gone silent. The city was still out there, still moving. Nothing had changed about the apartment. The kitchen island was the same granite. The overhead light was the same light. He had dismissed her for 8 years. He had taken her thinking, piece by piece, and worn it as his own, and he had never known. He had genuinely never known, which was the part he couldn't hold still, because he had assumed there was nothing worth knowing. He'd told Marcus she was limited. He'd said it without hesitation because he'd believed it without examination. And somewhere tonight, on a gold-plated jet or in a compound he'd never been allowed to see the address of, Serena Moretti was moving through a world that had been waiting for her to come home. He thought about calling her. He stood there for a long time, phone in his hand, not calling. The rain had started again outside, running in long diagonal lines across the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Grant Holloway stood in his expensive kitchen in the city he thought he'd conquered and felt, for the first time in a very long while, like the smallest person in any room he'd ever entered. Outside, somewhere above the clouds, the gold-plated jet carried Serena home, and in 3 days, though Grant didn't know this yet either, a man would be found dead in a private estate in Westchester County. The man's name would be Dominic Moretti, Serena's father, the patriarch, and the manner of his death would not be natural, and the people responsible would have made a catastrophic miscalculation about what kind of woman the quiet daughter had become. The call came at 6:14 in the morning, 3 days after the jet disappeared into the cloud cover above Manhattan. Serena was already awake. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the courthouse. Not from grief, not exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes when a part of your brain you've kept deliberately quiet for years suddenly powers back on, and you can't find the switch to dim it again. She was sitting at a window in the east wing of the Moretti estate in Westchester, a cup of coffee going cold on the sill beside her, watching the tree line where the security lights bled into the gray pre-dawn, when Lucien's head of security, a compact, stone-faced man named Dario, who had been with the family for 22 years, knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. That was how she knew it was bad. Dario always waited. "Your brother needs you," he said. "Now." She was already standing. The estate's main house was a 14-room structure built in the 1940s and expanded twice since, all dark wood and high ceilings, and the particular silence of a place that had absorbed too much history to be casual about noise. Serena had grown up inside these walls for the first 17 years of her life. She knew every floorboard that spoke, every window that rattled in a north wind, every room whose function had changed over the decades while its furniture stayed the same. She knew the room they kept for bad news. The study off the main hall, dark oak, maps on one wall, a fireplace that was never cold. She'd sat in it twice before. Once when she was 9 and her mother hadn't come home from a trip to Geneva, and once when she was 15 and her father had explained, in the measured voice he used for the things he could not make softer, why the family of one of her school friends would be moving away. Lucien was standing at the fireplace with his back to the door when she walked in. He didn't turn immediately. His right hand was pressed flat against the mantel, and his head was down, and in the gray light he looked 10 years older than he had at the runway 3 days ago. A man next to him, Carver, the family's chief counsel, late 50s, eyes that gave nothing away, stood with a tablet in both hands like he was holding something fragile. "Lucien," she said. He turned. His face confirmed what Dario's hesitation had already told her. "Dad's gone," he said. "Sometime last night. They found him this morning at the Westport property." The room went very still. Serena heard the fireplace. She heard her own breathing, which was deliberate and slow, because she made it deliberate and slow, because falling apart in front of Carver was not something she was willing to do. "How?" she said. Not a question, a demand. Lucien looked at Carver. Carver looked at his tablet. "2 shots," Carver said. "Close range. The exterior security was cut 12 minutes before the event. Whoever did this knew the rotation. That's not a robbery. No. That's not a rival taking a shot in the dark, either." "No," Carver said again. "It's not." Serena moved to the chair nearest the fireplace and sat down. Not because she needed to, but because she needed to be lower than both of them, while she thought needed the angle to be hers. Lucien came away from the mantel and stood across from her. His jaw was working. "How many people knew the Westport rotation?" she asked. 12. Internal. "Then we're looking at 12 people. Serena, we are looking at 12 people, Lucien. Start there. It could have been a surveillance breach. External penetration of the... Could have been," she said. "Wasn't. 2 shots, close range, cut the rotation from the inside. Someone told them when and where and how long the window was." She looked at Carver. "Who managed the rotation schedule?" "Vincent Callow, head of estate security for the Westport property." "Where's Vincent now?" A pause that was exactly 1 beat too long. "We don't know," Dario said from the doorway. Serena said nothing for a moment. She looked at the fire. She pressed one hand flat against her knee and felt the fabric of her pants, the warmth beneath it, the solid fact of her own body in the chair, and used it as an anchor the way she'd taught herself to do a long time ago, in a life she'd been trying not to live. "Find him," she said. "Don't call the police." "Serena." Lucien's voice had an edge now. "There's something else." She looked up. He sat down across from her. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and for a moment he looked exactly like their father. Same brow, same set to his mouth, same way of carrying difficult information like weight distributed across his whole body rather than in his face. "Dad changed the succession documents 8 months ago," Lucien said. "I only found out last week. Carver confirmed it." Serena waited. "He named you primary heir to the consolidated holdings, all of them, the legal structures, the international assets, the operational oversight." Lucien's voice didn't waver, but something behind his eyes did. Something complicated and not entirely clean. "Not me." The fire spoke. Outside, a security light clicked off as the dawn overtook it. "He didn't tell me," Serena said. "I know." "Lucien, I'm not angry at you." He said it like a man who has rehearsed the sentence until it became true. "I'm angry at him for making a decision like that without..." He stopped, pressed his fist briefly to his mouth. He should have told us both. Why did he do it? Lucien looked at Carver again. Carver set the tablet down on the edge of the desk and folded his hands. Your father believed the family was entering a period of significant external pressure, Carver said. 3 rival networks have been consolidating territory over the last 18 months. The Del Vecchio operation out of Philadelphia, the Strand Syndicate operating from offshore structures, and a third group we haven't fully identified yet. Your father's assessment was that navigating that landscape required a specific type of intelligence, strategic rather than operational. He looked at Serena steadily. He believed you had it, and that Lucien, he paused carefully, that Lucien's strengths were elsewhere. Lucien said nothing. His jaw was tight. He should have told you, Serena said to him. Yeah. A short sound, not quite a laugh. He should have done a lot of things. She stood. The room adjusted around her. That was how it felt. Like the pressure of the space shifted when she moved. Dario straightened in the doorway. Carver picked the tablet back up reflexively. I need the full security footage from Westport for the 72 hours prior. I need Vincent Callow found, alive, if possible, because dead men don't explain their decisions. I need a complete list of everyone who had access to the succession documents, because whoever killed our father knew about the inheritance change, and that narrows this considerably. She looked at Lucien, and I need you to not shut me out while you process this, because I need you. He held her gaze. Something shifted. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. She walked out of the study and into the long hallway, and Dario fell into step behind her without being asked. Her footsteps on the hardwood were even and unhurried. Her hands were steady at her sides. She didn't cry until she reached her room. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her face and let herself have 90 seconds of it. The grief cracking through in waves, her father's voice in her memory, the particular way he'd said her name on the runway 3 days ago, his hands holding her face, the expression he'd had that she'd misread as joy and now understood was something more complicated. He'd known. He'd come to the runway knowing he might not see her again, and instead of telling her, he just held her face in his hands and looked at her like he was committing her to memory. 90 seconds. Then she breathed out, dropped her hands, and stood. There was work to do. 230 miles south, in the Tribeca penthouse, Grant Holloway was on his 3rd cup of coffee and his 2nd hour of sitting in front of a laptop he wasn't really using. The folder Marcus had couriered over was still on the kitchen island. He'd moved it twice, once to the dining table, once back, without opening it again. The numbers didn't change when he didn't look at them. Camille had left at 7 for a client breakfast. She'd kissed him on the cheek and asked twice if he was all right, and he'd said yes both times, and she'd accepted it because she was too busy to press, and he was too tired to be grateful for that. His phone had 43 unread messages. His assistant had called 4 times. His COO, Brent Galloway, who was not related and hated when people assumed he was, had sent a single text at 8:15 that read, "We need to talk today." Not over text. Grant had replied, "Afternoon, my office." He hadn't moved from the kitchen. The thing about the folder, the thing he couldn't get past, wasn't the liability numbers. Numbers could be negotiated, reframed, disputed with sufficient legal firepower and enough controlled leaking of counter-narrative to trade publications. He'd navigated worse. What he couldn't navigate was the knowledge itself, sitting inside his chest like a stone. He had spent 6 years building a reputation on borrowed genius and had never known it. He hadn't stolen from her. That much he was sure of. He hadn't consciously taken her work. He had listened to her talk at dinner about market structures and volatility asymmetries and the way that a man listens to his wife's professional interests with one ear while his mind is already somewhere else. And some of those ideas had landed somewhere in his memory and resurfaced later as his own thoughts. And he had never once traced them back to the source. He had dismissed the source too completely to trace anything back to her. The thing about dismissing someone entirely, he was learning, was that it didn't protect you from them. It just meant you absorbed their influence without attribution, like breathing air you never thought to analyze. His phone lit up. Unknown number, Manhattan area code. He answered. "Mr. Holloway." The voice was male, measured, the kind of flat effect that usually meant legal training or law enforcement. My name is Carver. I represent the Moretti family interests. I'm calling as a professional courtesy to inform you that a civil recovery action related to intellectual property originating during your marriage may be filed in the Southern District within the next 30 days. You'll want to notify your counsel. Grant's hand tightened on the phone. I appreciate the warning, he said, because he'd learned a long time ago not to speak past those 4 words when you didn't know the shape of a room. There is also a secondary matter, Carver said. Mr. Holloway, Dominic Moretti passed away last night. I'm telling you this because our preliminary review suggests your former business associates may have had some peripheral involvement in events surrounding his death. I'd encourage you to review your professional relationships carefully over the next several days. The line went quiet. Grant said, "What does that mean, peripheral involvement?" "It means," Carver said, "that some of the people you trust may have been playing a longer game than you understood. I'd recommend extreme caution. Good day." The line cut. Grant sat with the dead phone against his ear for a moment longer, then set it face down on the counter. Dominic Moretti was dead. He knew the name. Everyone in his world knew the name, even if they spoke it carefully and not often. The patriarch. The architect. The man who had called Serena by her family name on an airstrip 3 days ago. Serena's father. And Carver had just told him, in the clean, indirect language of people who operated in spaces where directness was a luxury, that the people Grant worked with might be connected to his murder. He thought about Brent's text. "We need to talk today." He thought about his mentor, the man who had funded Grant's first fund, who had introduced him to the network that made everything else possible, who had sat across from him at dinners and smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that warmth was an instrument. He thought about things he hadn't let himself think about before, because success tends to discourage the examination of its own foundations. He picked up the phone and called Marcus. "I need everything we have on Harlan Voss," he said. "Every contract, every introduction he made, every entity he connected us to. All of it. Today." Marcus said, "Grant, that's going to take today, Marcus." But the Moretti Estates Security Center was a room the size of a large closet in the basement of the East Wing, climate-controlled, lined with monitors, staffed around the clock by 2-person teams who rotated every 8 hours. Serena stood in it at 2 in the afternoon with Dario at her shoulder and watched 72 hours of Westport footage in accelerated segments. The breach was clean, almost elegant. The exterior cameras had gone dark in a rolling sequence. Not a system crash, not a power failure, but a targeted suppression that moved through the network with the logic of someone who knew its architecture, someone who had been inside it. They found Vincent Callow's car at 317, a parking structure in White Plains, 3rd level. He was in the driver's seat with his phone in his lap and a single gunshot wound that the responding team confirmed had come from behind. He'd been dead before Grant's morning coffee. Whoever had used Vincent to get access to the rotation schedule had ended that relationship the moment it became a liability. Serena looked at the photograph Dario's team had sent to his phone and felt something tighten in her chest that wasn't grief. It was closer to clarity. "He didn't run," she said. "No." He thought they were done with him. He thought he'd been paid and cut loose, and he went somewhere to sit quietly and wait for things to blow over. She handed the phone back. "He didn't know you don't get cut loose from this. You just get cut. We're pulling his financials now. First deposit traces to a shell account that routes through..." Dario looked at his tablet. "A holding company, Hartwell Meridian Capital." Serena turned her head. "Say that again." "Hartwell Meridian Capital, Delaware registration, 2019. Beneficial ownership is obscured through a 3-layer trust structure, but the registered agent's address cross-references to..." "I know that company," Serena said. Dario waited. "It's Harlan Voss." She said it quietly, almost to herself, working through it like pressing on a bruise to find out how deep it went. "It's one of Harlan Voss's vehicles. I saw that name in a due diligence file years ago. Grant's firm received seed funding through Voss's network, and Hartwell Meridian was one of the feeder entities." The room was very quiet. "Serena," Dario's voice was careful. "If that's accurate, Then the man who funded my ex-husband's career had our father killed. She looked at the monitors. The Westport footage was still cycling on one screen. The empty driveway, the dark house, the moment when everything that was supposed to stop things like this had simply stopped. And that means Grant was either part of it, or he was used. She paused. I need to know which. How do you want to proceed? She thought for a moment. She thought about 8 years of a quiet life and what it had cost her and what it had built in her that nothing else could have built. The patience, the ability to remain invisible, the understanding of how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Get me everything on Voss, she said. Everything that isn't in a court file, and find out who else in the Voss network has been touching the accounts connected to the rival syndicates. If he's coordinating an acquisition play, if he's trying to collapse the family and absorb the assets while the syndicates create the chaos, then he has financial fingerprints somewhere. People like Voss always do. And Grant? She was quiet for a moment. Leave Grant alone for now, she said. He's going to come here. Dario looked at her. He doesn't know the address. He'll find it, she said. He's desperate and he's scared and he's starting to understand that the floor under him is someone else's design. Men like Grant always come looking for the thing they threw away once they realize what it was worth. She turned away from the monitors. Let him come. I want to see his face when he gets here. Harlan Voss was 71 years old and had spent the last 4 decades building a fortune so diversified that no single government could fully map it. He operated from a townhouse on the Upper East Side with a staff of 11 and an investment office in Midtown that employed 43 people and managed $12 billion in declared assets. The declared number was the joke he told himself at breakfast. He was sitting in his study on the townhouse's 3rd floor when his phone rang. His man Prescott answered, the way Prescott answered everything, quietly, efficiently, his face showing exactly nothing. It's Strand, Prescott said. Voss held out his hand for the phone. Tell me, he said. The voice on the other end was Elliot Strand, 54, British educated, ran his operation from offshore structures that technically didn't exist in any jurisdiction that mattered. His voice had the kind of smooth precision that came from spending a lifetime making catastrophic things sound administrative. Moretti's people found Callow, Strand said. Faster than anticipated. That was expected. They've also identified Hartwell Meridian. Voss was quiet for a moment, then, how? Unknown. The daughter, presumably. She has access to her ex-husband's financial records through the recovery action they've initiated, and apparently she's considerably more capable than, I know what she is, Voss said. He stood and moved to the window. The street below was doing what streets on the Upper East Side did in the afternoon. Expensive, unhurried, self-satisfied. I've known what she is for longer than her husband did. Then you understand we need to accelerate. What I understand, Voss said, is that moving too fast is how this falls apart. The succession change to the daughter creates a problem, yes. It consolidates authority in someone who is harder to predict than Lucien, but it also creates an opportunity because she's been out of this world for 8 years, and the people around her haven't fully accepted her authority yet. He paused, including her brother. Strand said, You're betting on a family fracture. I'm betting on the fact that inherited grief and inherited resentment are the most reliable weapons available to us, and we don't need to manufacture them. They're already there. Voss turned from the window. Give it 72 hours. Apply pressure on the Del Vecchio front. Push them toward the Moretti northern operations. Make it look like opportunistic encroachment. Lucien will want to respond with force. Serena will want to respond with strategy. And the disagreement between them will do more damage than anything we could deliver from outside. A pause. And if it doesn't fracture? Voss looked at Prescott, who was standing by the door with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance. Then we go in person, Voss said, and we finish it, Voss. Grant arrived at the Moretti estate at 4 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, which was 3 days after Carver's call, and approximately 36 hours after Marcus had come back to him with the first layer of Harlan Voss's financial architecture spread across 14 pages of investigative accounting. What Grant had read in those pages had made him physically cold in a way that no amount of movement through his apartment had fixed. Voss had been his mentor for 11 years. Voss had introduced him to the networks that opened the doors that built the firm. Voss had sat across from him at dinners and charity events and quarterly reviews and had been everything a mentor was supposed to be. Generous with access, measured with advice. The kind of man who made you feel like his investment in you was personal. It was personal. That was the problem. It was profoundly, precisely, devastatingly personal, just not in the direction Grant had assumed. He had found the estate address through Marcus, who had found it through channels Grant deliberately didn't ask about. He'd driven himself, which he almost never did, because he didn't want a driver knowing where he went or how long he stayed. The gate was a pair of iron panels set into a stone wall that disappeared in both directions into old-growth trees. A guard post. Two men visible, more probably not visible. One of them approached the car, and Grant rolled down the window and gave his name and said he was here to see Serena. The guard looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Wait." Grant waited. 7 minutes. Long enough to consider leaving twice and both times not leave. Long enough to watch his hands on the steering wheel and notice they weren't entirely steady. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved. One line. Open the gate for him. The gate opened. He drove a quarter-mile up a gravel drive through trees that were starting to turn, red and gold against a gray October sky, until the house appeared. Large, old, serious in the way that buildings become serious when they've held significant things inside them for long enough. Serena was standing on the front steps. She was wearing dark trousers and a black sweater, and her hair was down, and she looked— he searched for the word and found it quietly devastating. She looked exactly like herself. Not the version of herself he'd constructed out of his own dismissal. The actual thing, present and contained and watching him with those dark, steady eyes as he got out of the car and crossed the gravel toward her. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. She didn't come down to meet him. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "I know you are." "Serena, I know why you're here, Grant." Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm. Something more controlled than either. "You found out about Voss." He opened his mouth. "Marcus pulled the Hartwell Meridian trace, and it connected to Voss's network, and you spent the last 2 days understanding that the man who built your career might have had my father murdered." She watched him. "How close am I?" "Very," he said. "Come inside." She turned toward the door. "We have things to discuss that shouldn't happen on a gravel driveway." He followed her up the steps and through the door, and the house closed around him. The weight of it, the silence, the sense of history absorbed into the walls. And Grant Holloway understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he was not here as a man with leverage or options or the ability to negotiate from strength. He was here because Serena had let him in. And in the room at the end of the hallway, visible through an open door, 2 men he didn't know were watching him walk through their house with the particular attention of people who were deciding something about him that he would not be consulted on. He kept his face neutral and followed his ex-wife deeper into the world she'd never told him existed. Behind him, unheard and unseen, a phone in Prescott's hand sent a single message to Harlan Voss. Holloway just entered the Moretti estate. Voss read it, set the phone down, and said to the room, "Well, now it gets interesting." He reached for the second phone, the one with the number that connected to a man Grant had never met, operating from a location the authorities of 4 countries had spent years trying to identify, and made the call that would, by the following morning, change the shape of everything. The order wasn't complicated. Voss had always preferred clean instructions to elaborate ones. The study smelled like old paper and cold coffee and the particular silence of a room where serious things had recently been said and not yet resolved. Serena sat behind the desk. Not her father's chair. She hadn't touched that yet, wasn't ready to touch it, had moved a side chair around to the working position instead, which Carver had noticed and said nothing about. Grant sat across from her in one of the 2 chairs facing the desk, his jacket on, his hands folded, looking like a man who had come prepared for a negotiation and arrived to find the building on fire. Lucien stood against the far wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on Grant like he was solving a math problem he didn't particularly want the answer to. Dario was by the door. Carver was at the side table with his tablet, and the expression of a man who had been in rooms like this enough times to know that the outcome was not yet determined and that patience was the only currency worth holding. Grant said, "I didn't know." Nobody responded. About Voss, about what he was doing, what he was connected to, I want to be clear about that. Serena looked at him steadily. "I know you didn't know," she said. "That's not actually the part I'm interested in right now." "Then what part?" "The part where you help me understand everything you do know." She leaned forward slightly. "Every introduction Voss made for you, every entity he connected you to, every meeting, every deal, every favor, starting from the beginning." Grant looked at Lucian. Lucian looked back at him with an expression that communicated clearly that looking at Lucian for help was not going to produce help. "That's 11 years of business history," Grant said. "I have time," Serena said. He talked for 2 hours. He was, Serena had to admit, and she admitted it only to herself. In the quiet part of her mind, she kept separate from the room, more forthcoming than she'd expected. Either the fear had stripped him down to functional honesty, or he'd spent the drive up here deciding that his only play was full transparency. Probably both. Grant had always been good at identifying his own best interest, even when he was slow to identify everything else. He walked them through the architecture of the Voss relationship. The initial meeting at a conference in 2013, the seed funding that arrived through Hartwell Meridian, and 2 other entities she now had names for. The introductions to the network of institutional investors that had given his fund legitimacy before it had earned it. The advisory relationship that had looked like mentorship and functioned more like a leash. He talked about Brent Galloway, his COO, who had come to the firm as a Voss recommendation. He talked about 3 board members who had the same origin. He talked about a due diligence process on a 2019 acquisition that Voss had steered him away from at the last moment, a maritime logistics company with terminals in 4 ports, and how he hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Dario was writing. When Grant got to the maritime logistics company, Serena held up one hand. "Stop," she said. Grant stopped. She looked at Carver. "The Moretti shipping interests, Northern terminal operations, what's the portfolio?" Carver pulled something up, read. His face didn't change, but his stillness changed, which for Carver was the equivalent of an alarm going off. 4 terminals, North Atlantic Corridor. The largest one is the Port Newark facility, which your father acquired in 2017 through the Alcott Trust. And the maritime logistics company Voss steered Grant away from in 2019, Serena said. Was it competing for the same terminal access? Carver checked. A beat. 2. The company's primary asset was a long-term lease on a Port Newark facility that would have given a competitor control of adjacent operations, Carver said. If Holloway's firm had acquired it, it would have given Grant's firm a footprint that overlapped with ours. Serena leaned back. Voss stopped him from buying it because having Grant inside our operational territory would have complicated Voss's own acquisition plan. She looked at Grant. He wasn't protecting you from a bad deal. He was protecting his own play. Grant's jaw tightened. He told me the company had regulatory exposure. It didn't? Apparently not. Lucian pushed off the wall. So Voss has been positioning for a run at our port operations for how long? At least 2019, Serena said. Probably longer. The assassination... She paused. It still caught in her throat when she said it plainly. She pushed through. Dad's assassination clears the succession. The syndicate pressure from Del Vecchio and Strand creates operational chaos, and somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Voss steps in with capital and legal structures and takes control of the terminal network while we're too fractured and under siege to stop him. She turned to Carver. He doesn't want the criminal operation. He wants the infrastructure. 40-year leases on 4 major port terminals, Carver said quietly, represent a legitimate asset base of approximately $9 billion at current valuation. And if you control the terminals, Serena said, you control what moves through them, which is worth considerably more than $9 billion to the right people. The room absorbed this. Grant said, I'll testify. If it comes to it, I'll document everything, every entity, every introduction, the full Voss network as I know it. Lucian looked at him with something between contempt and reluctant reassessment. You'd burn your own mentor. He used me to get close to something that got Serena's father killed, Grant said. His voice was flat and factual. Yeah, I'd burn on him. Serena studied her ex-husband for a long moment, the man she'd married at 26 and spent 8 years quietly outgrowing while he spent 8 years looking through her. He wasn't a bad man in the fundamental sense, not cruel, not calculating in the way that Voss was calculating. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more depressing. A man who had never thought to look carefully at what was right in front of him because he'd decided in advance it wasn't worth looking at. That was its own kind of damage, but it wasn't the same kind as murder. Stay in the house tonight, she said. Don't contact Voss, don't contact Brent, don't contact anyone in your professional network. Carver will have a document for you to sign regarding your cooperation. In the morning, we'll discuss next steps. And if I want to leave? She looked at him. You drove up here voluntarily, she said. The gate works in both directions. But if you leave and Voss finds out you've been here before, we're ready for him to know, which he'll find out because he has sources we haven't fully identified yet. Then whatever protection being in this house currently provides you disappears. She paused. Your choice? Grant looked around the room, at Dario by the door, at Lucien against the wall, at Carver with his tablet and his neutral, precise face. I'll stay, he said. It was 11:40 at night when the first perimeter alarm tripped. Serena was in the security center with Dario, reviewing the financial documents Carver had been compiling, when the monitor on the far left of the bank flickered and the alert tone, low, not loud, the kind calibrated not to cause panic but to demand attention, sounded twice. Dario was at the console in 3 steps. Sector 7, said the guard on duty, a young man named Torres, compact and steady-handed. Northeast corner, motion on the outer perimeter. Wildlife? Dario said. Checking. Torres pulled the camera feed, enhanced it. The image was infrared, green-gray, the tree line in the northeast corner of the estate wall rendered in degrees of heat rather than visible light. No, that's... He stopped. The image showed 4 figures moving in single file along the exterior of the stone wall, low and fast, wearing equipment that was absorbing enough heat signature that the camera was catching only their outlines. Military-grade thermal suppression gear. How many on the outer rotation right now? Serena said. 6, Dario said. 2 per sector, 3 sectors covered at a time, rotating every 40 minutes. They know our rotation. They killed the man who gave it to them. They had it before they killed him. She was already moving to the wall where the tactical radio system was mounted. Get everyone in. Pull the outer rotation inside the wall now. Don't engage in the trees. I want everyone inside defensive positions before these people clear the perimeter. If we pull back, they'll know we spotted them. They already know we spotted them. That alarm was too fast for them to have expected it. She looked at Torres. What did you change in the system today? Torres said, extended the motion sensitivity threshold on the northeast and northwest sectors. After what happened at Westport, I figured, good call, she said. Do it. Dario was already on the radio, voice-controlled and rapid, pulling the outer teams in. Serena crossed to the monitor bank and counted figures. 4 on the northeast. She moved to the other cameras methodically, and Torres was already ahead of her, sweeping sectors. Southwest corner, 3 figures. Main gate approach, off-road through the tree line. 2 vehicles running dark, no headlights, moving slow. 9 minimum on foot, Torres said. 2 vehicles. This is a coordinated breach. They're hitting 4 entry points simultaneously, Serena said. This isn't a threat. This is an assault. She picked up the radio. Lucien. His voice came back in 4 seconds, which meant he was already awake, which meant some part of him had been waiting for this. I hear it. What do we have? 9 on foot, 2 vehicles, 4-point breach, northeast, southwest, main gate, and she looked at Torres. He was pulling another camera. His face changed. South Garden wall, he said. 3 more. They're already over. South Garden, she said into the radio. Lucien, they're already inside the south wall. Get away from the windows and get to the central corridor. Now. Grant's in the east wing. I know where Grant is. She dropped the radio and looked at Dario. "Tell me we have enough inside," she said. Dario's expression gave her the answer before his words did. 14 active on the interior. If they're hitting 4 points with this kind of equipment and coordination, it's enough if we hold the choke points, she said. Main hall, East Corridor Junction, the central stairwell. Funnel them and don't let them spread. She was already moving toward the door. And get the emergency line to the state police open. Not because I want them here, but because I want Voss to know he has a timer. Serena. Dario caught her arm. Not rough. Careful. You need to stay in the... I need to find my brother, she said. Move. The South Garden was a series of formal hedgerows and stone pathways that in daylight looked peaceful in the aggressive, curated way of old money landscaping. In the dark, with 3 armed men moving through it, it looked like exactly what it was, a killing ground. Lucian knew the South Garden better than any room in the house. He'd been 17 the first time his father had walked him through it at night and explained that beauty was a kind of misdirection, that you planted something lovely in the spaces between your defenses, not because you liked flowers, but because the people coming for you would look at the flowers instead of the angles. He was crouched behind the stone balustrade at the garden's north end, 9mm in his right hand, listening. He could hear them, not clearly. They were good, disciplined, moving with the silence of training rather than instinct. But he could hear the slight compression of gravel that no amount of careful footwork entirely eliminates, and he could track their spacing by it. 3 men, moving in a loose triangle formation, sweeping toward the house's south entrance. They hadn't seen him yet. What they also hadn't seen, because they'd come over the south wall and moved directly toward the house, following the line of the path, was that Lucian had not come from the house. He'd come from the garden shed at the south end, the one his father used to call the reading house, the one with the false floor beneath the work table that contained a weapons cache his father had put there in 1987 and updated every 3 years since. Lucien had 3 men's weapon weight advantage on the people coming toward him, and he had the garden's geometry in his memory like a blueprint. He let them get to within 20 feet of the balustrade. Then one of the interior radios he'd grabbed from the security center crackled. Torres's voice, sharp and precise. South Garden team, hold position. We have a civilian running the east corridor. Repeat, civilian in the east. The 3 men in the garden stopped. Lucien stopped breathing. One of them said something, low and rapid, into a mic at his collar. A language Lucien recognized but didn't speak. Eastern European, possibly Czech, possibly Slovak, the kind of thing that showed up when you were hiring from the Eastern networks rather than the domestic ones. Then the man turned and looked directly at the balustrade. Not at Lucien specifically. At the balustrade. Like someone had told him in his earpiece exactly where to look. The cold that moved through Lucien then was not fear. It was the specific, nauseating sensation of realizing that the information this team was operating on was too precise. The garden layout, the balustrade position, the weapons cache location. Because the man who just turned was now not moving toward the house. He was moving toward the garden shed. Someone had told them. Someone inside this estate had told them. Lucien fired twice. The man going for the shed went down. The other 2 broke in opposite directions, and Lucien was already moving, using the hedgerow line for cover, the garden's geometry doing exactly what his father had promised it would do, creating angles the attackers couldn't hold simultaneously. But the math was bad. 2 against 1 in the dark was bad math. He got to the east side of the garden and pressed against the stone wall of the house. His shoulder was bleeding to him. He realized it distantly. The way you realize peripheral things in the middle of something that requires your entire attention. A graze, not deep, but his shirt was wet. One of the 2 remaining men had gone for the south entrance. The other was somewhere in the hedgerows, and Lucien couldn't hear him anymore, and that was the worst thing. His radio crackled. Serena's voice. Lucien, report. South Garden, 1 down, 2 split. East side of the house. Shoulder. How bad? Doesn't matter. Serena, listen. He pressed harder against the stone, scanning the hedgerow line in the dark. Someone inside told these people the garden layout, the cache position. They knew where to look. A long pause. Say that again, she said. There's a source inside this house. Tonight. These people knew things they couldn't know from Vincent Callow's rotation schedule. He forced himself to breathe slow. Who has been in this house in the last 72 hours that wasn't here before? The pause this time was different, shorter and colder. Grant, she said. Grant Holloway had not been sleeping. He'd been sitting on the edge of the bed in the East Wing guest room with his phone in his hand, not using it, watching the window and thinking about the shape of the last 2 weeks with the specific clarity that comes to a person who has finally, too late, always too late, begun to see the true geometry of his situation. Harlan Voss had built him. That was the fact he kept returning to. Not mentored, not invested in, built. The way you build a tool for a specific purpose, and the purpose was never Grant's advancement. It was access. Access to Serena's financial intelligence through their marriage, access to her ideas, her analyses, her thinking, which Voss had somehow known about and wanted laundered through a public-facing firm that wouldn't raise the kind of attention direct Moretti involvement would raise. Voss had used Grant as a lens to focus on Serena without Serena or her family ever knowing they were being studied. The question that was sitting in Grant's chest like something swallowed wrong was, how had Voss known what Serena was worth before Grant had even known? The answer, when it came, arrived with the quiet logic of a thing that had always been true. Voss had known about Serena because someone in the Moretti family had told him. The explosion hit the East Wing at 11:58 precisely. Not the room Grant was in, but close enough that the concussion moved through the wall and threw him sideways off the bed and onto the floor, and the window above him crazed into 1,000 contained cracks and then fell inward, and the noise was enormous, and then immediately replaced by a ringing silence and the smell of smoke. Grant was on his hands and knees on the guest room floor, with plaster dust in his hair, and his ears ringing and the cold October air coming through the ruined window. He got to his feet. The hallway outside his room was full of gray smoke drifting from the east end. The explosion had hit the East Junction, the corridor intersection that Serena had identified as a choke point, and the tactical logic of that was clear even to Grant in his current state. It had been designed to open the East Wing rather than destroy it. A shape charge, not a bomb. Surgical. He moved toward the door and stopped. 2 men were in the corridor, not Moretti security. The equipment was different. The body armor, the configuration of the weapons, the way they moved without announcing themselves. They were sweeping the corridor systematically, checking doors, and they were moving toward his room. Grant backed up. He looked at the ruined window, 3 floors. The south garden below, dark hedgerows, stone pathways. A fall from this height onto stone would be the end of several things. He looked at the door. He looked at the window again. Then he saw the thing outside the window he hadn't processed in the first second of looking. The stone architectural detail running along the exterior wall, a decorative ledge maybe 8 inches wide, and below it another. And the downspout running from the roofline to the garden level perhaps 4 feet to the left. He had never in his adult life climbed a building exterior. He heard the door handle move. He went out the window. Serena was in the main hall when Dario's hand came down on her shoulder, not pushing, redirecting, physically moving her 2 feet to the left as a second explosion hit somewhere above and to the east, and the chandelier above the main staircase swung and dropped a crystal that shattered on the marble 6 feet from where she'd been standing. "East Wing is breached," Torres said in her ear through the radio. 2 tangos inside, 3rd floor corridor. "Lucien," she said into her radio. "South garden, contained. 1 loose." His voice was tighter than before. "Shoulder is worse than I said. Get inside, main hall, now." She turned to Dario. "I need an account of everyone in this house, right now. Your brother, Carver. He's in the study, confirmed. Torres in the center. 6 of our interior team across 3 positions. Holloway in the East Wing guest room." "Someone get eyes on Holloway." Her radio crackled. A voice she recognized as Reyes, one of the interior teams. Young, fast, extremely competent. "East Wing 3rd floor. Holloway's room is open and empty. Windows out." Serena processed that. "He went out the window?" "Ground level South Garden team is reporting a man on the exterior wall," Reyes said, and she could hear the disbelief in it. Ma'am, he's climbing down the downspout. Dario made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Serena might have made one too under other circumstances. Tell the South team not to shoot him, she said. He came down wrong, Reyes said. He's on the ground. He's up. He's moving toward the East Garden hedge line. He's... A pause. He just tackled someone. Serena stopped moving. What? The loose tango from the South Garden. Lucien couldn't locate him. Holloway just came off the downspout and landed on the man from behind. Reyes sounded genuinely uncertain how to categorize this information. They're on the ground. Holloway's got him in some kind of... I don't know what that is. Our team is moving. Serena started moving again. She pushed through the south entrance. Dario 2 steps behind, weapon drawn, scanning, and into the garden. The October air hit her face, cold and carrying smoke from the east wing above. Flashlight beams were sweeping the hedgerow line. She followed them. Grant Holloway was sitting on a stone pathway with his back against a hedgerow, his hands on his knees, breathing like a man who had recently experienced more physical exertion than he'd planned for. His jacket was destroyed. There was blood on his forearm from the window glass and dirt on everything else. 3 feet away, one of Reyes's team had the man he'd taken down in a controlled position on the ground, weapons secured. Grant looked up when Serena reached him. I don't recommend the downspout, he said, for future reference. She looked at the man on the ground, Eastern European build, mid-30s, the thermal suppression gear Lucien had described. Professional, expensive to field. She crouched down and looked at his face. And the recognition that moved through her then was so cold and so complete that she sat very still for a moment, just looking, making sure she wasn't wrong. She wasn't wrong. She knew this man, not personally. From a photograph, a surveillance image Carver had included in a briefing packet 18 months before she'd left the family, showing the security personnel attached to a specific organization, an organization that at the time had been identified as independent of the Voss network, separate from the Strand operation, a third player, the one they hadn't fully identified. She stood. Dario, she said. Her voice was very controlled. Get Carver, right now. What is it? The third syndicate. She looked at the man on the ground. This isn't Voss's team. These are Strand's people. She paused. Which means Voss didn't order this attack. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Which means, she said, Voss and Strand are not coordinating. They're competing, and whoever is playing them against each other... She stopped. Carver appeared at the garden entrance, breathing slightly fast, his tablet somehow still in his hand. The succession documents, Serena said to him. Who had access outside this family? Full list, everyone. Carver looked at his tablet, scrolled. His face, the face that showed nothing, showed something. 4 people outside the family had document access, he said. 2 estate attorneys who have been with us for decades. 1 notary, he paused. And the 4th person was your father's private advisor. A man named Don't, Lucien said. He was standing at the garden's south entrance, right hand pressed to his left shoulder, shirt dark with blood. His face was gray and his jaw was set, and he was looking at Carver with an expression that Serena had never seen on her brother's face in her entire life. She turned to look at him. Lucien, she said carefully. Don't say the name, Lucien said. His voice had gone strange, quiet and breakable and very, very controlled. Just give me a second. Who is it? She said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something that has finally become too heavy, and the weight of it was in every line of his face. It's Uncle Ren, he said. Lorenzo Moretti, their father's younger brother, the man who had sat at every family dinner Serena could remember, who had bounced her on his knee when she was small, who had stood at their mother's funeral with his hand on Dominic's shoulder, who had managed the family's private trust accounts for 30 years with a loyalty so consistent and unquestioned that no one had ever thought to question it. The man who had known the Westport rotation, the man who had known the garden layout, the man who had known the succession had been changed to Serena, the man who had the most to gain from chaos and the most to lose from a daughter taking the throne over the son. he'd spent 3 decades cultivating as his instrument. Because if Lucien led the family, Lorenzo Moretti controlled the family. And if Serena led it, Lorenzo Moretti was finished. Serena stood in the cold October garden with blood on the stone around her and smoke still drifting from the east wing, and her brother looking at her with the face of a man whose world had just cracked along a fault line he'd never known existed. And she understood, with a total and devastating clarity, that the enemy had never been outside the walls. It had been at every dinner table. It had known her name since she was born. And it had waited, with the patience of family, for exactly the right moment to use everything it knew. "Move on the estate," he said. "Tonight." They moved Lorenzo inside at gunpoint. Not roughly. There was no need for rough, because Lorenzo Moretti was 70 years old and had not personally performed violence in 4 decades, and everyone in the garden understood this, but with a precision that communicated clearly that the room for ambiguity had closed. Dario's hand was on his left arm. Reyes took the right. Lorenzo walked between them through the south entrance and down the main hall and into the study where the fire was still burning, and he sat in the chair facing the desk without being told to, which told Serena something about how long he'd been rehearsing this moment. She sat behind the desk. Lucien stood against the fireplace with his wounded shoulder dressed in a field bandage Reyes had applied in the garden, the white gauze already showing a bloom of red at the center. He hadn't said anything since the garden. He was doing the thing he did when he was containing something enormous, jaw locked, eyes fixed on a specific point, breathing through his nose in a rhythm that was too deliberate to be natural. Grant was in the hallway outside. Carver had asked him to wait there, and he had, which was either good judgment or exhaustion, probably both. Serena looked at her uncle. Lorenzo Moretti had a face built for the long game, deep-set eyes, a nose that had been broken twice and healed both times without vanity, white hair cropped close, the hands of a man who had once done physical work and never entirely lost the look of it. He was wearing a wool cardigan over a collared shirt, and he looked, sitting there in the firelight, like someone's grandfather. He looked at her with something she wasn't expecting. Not fear, not defiance. Grief. The real kind. The kind that sits in the muscles of the face and can't be performed because it costs too much to fake. And that, more than anything else in the last 12 hours, made Serena's chest constrict, because grief meant he believed he'd had reasons. "Start talking," she said. Lorenzo folded his hands on his knee. He looked at Lucien first, a long look, something passing between them that Serena couldn't fully read but recognized as the wreckage of something that had been carefully built over decades. Then he looked at her. "Your father changed the succession documents 8 months ago," he said. "He didn't tell me. He didn't tell Lucien. He made the decision alone, the way he made every decision that mattered, and I found out the way I find out everything your father didn't want me to know. From Carver's files, because Carver keeps copies of everything, and Carver's security has one door your father forgot I knew about." He paused. "I want you to understand that what I did because I believed the family would not survive under your leadership. Not because of who you are, because of what you'd been away from for 8 years, and what that absence cost you in terms of the relationships and the credibility you'd need to hold this thing together." "You believed Lucien should lead," Serena said. "I believed I could help Lucien lead. Which is not the same thing, but I've had enough years to know the difference doesn't always matter in practice." Lucien made a sound, not a word. Something that started as a word and didn't complete. "And my father?" Serena said. Lorenzo looked at the fire. "I didn't order your father's death," he said. "Then who did?" "Strand." He said it without hesitation. Elliot Strand moved on Dominic independently. "I was negotiating with Strand, trying to reach an arrangement that would stabilize the family's position in exchange for territorial concessions in the northern operations. Strand used those negotiations to gather intelligence about your father's movements, his security, his schedule." His jaw tightened. "I gave him access I shouldn't have given him, not to kill Dominic, to negotiate, but Strand is not a man who negotiates when he can eliminate, and I—" He stopped. "You gave him the weapon without knowing it," Serena said. "Yes." And then when Dad was dead and you saw the succession change, I panicked, Lorenzo said. It came out quiet and flat and honest in the way that only very old shame is honest. I panicked and I made contact with Strand again, not to conspire, to warn him that the succession change meant the family's response would be different than he expected, more organized, more dangerous. He looked at her directly. I told him you were back. I told him what that meant. And he sent a team, Serena said. I didn't ask him to. But you gave him the garden layout, the rotation. A long pause. I didn't know he was going to use it tonight, Lorenzo said. I thought I was giving him information to convince him to stand down, to make him understand that attacking now would be costly enough to be prohibitive. His voice fractured slightly on the last word. I was wrong about what he'd do with it. The study was very quiet. The fire moved. Lucien's breathing remained deliberate and controlled and terrible to hear. Serena stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, the flashlight beams still moving, the security team doing its post-breach sweep, 2 men she'd grown up trusting working the perimeter of a house her family had held for 60 years. The east wing had a hole in it. Her brother's shoulder had a hole in it. Her father was in a funeral home in White Plains waiting for decisions she hadn't had time to make yet. She turned back. Voss, she said, tell me about Voss. Lorenzo blinked. Voss is connected to the Hartwell Meridian accounts that funded Vincent Callow's payment. Callow ran the Westport rotation. Westport is where my father died. She watched his face. Tell me Voss's role. Something shifted in Lorenzo's expression. A recalibration, fast and subtle. The look of a man updating a map. Voss is not coordinating with Strand, he said slowly. Voss has been trying to acquire our port infrastructure through legitimate financial pressure, leveraged buyout attempts on the trust structures, legal maneuvers against the terminal leases. He's not a violence man. A pause. But if Hartwell Meridian touched the Callow payment, it did. Then Voss has been playing both sides, Lorenzo said, funding the chaos through Strand's operation without getting his hands on the violence itself. Let Strand create the instability, let the family fracture, then arrive with a rescue offer that's actually an acquisition. He shook his head slowly. That's Voss. That's exactly Voss. So Voss and Strand both want the same outcome and neither knows the other is pursuing it, Serena said. They may know, Lorenzo said. Men like that sometimes run parallel plays deliberately. Redundancy. Except now Strand's team is on my lawn, and Voss doesn't know his night just failed. Serena moved back to the desk. She sat. She put both hands flat on the surface and felt the solid wood beneath her palms and used it. Lorenzo. She said his name without inflection. Here's what happens now. You're going to make a call to Strand. Tonight. You are going to tell him the estate assault failed, but that you've secured access to the succession documents, and that there's a deal to be made if he can get to a meeting by tomorrow morning. Name a location he'll find credible. Carver will provide you the details. Lorenzo stared at her. You want to use me as bait, he said. I want to use you as the thing you already are, she said. His source. His contact inside, the person he trusts because he thinks he owns you. She held his gaze. He doesn't own you, but he doesn't know that yet. And if he doesn't come, if he sends people instead, then we deal with people instead, she said. But Strand is going to come, because the one thing men like Strand cannot delegate is the moment when they think they've won. Lorenzo was quiet for a long time. He looked at Lucien once more, and this time Lucien looked back, and whatever moved between them was complicated and broken and probably irreparable. But at the end of it, Lucien gave one short nod. All right, Lorenzo said. Good. Serena stood again. Carver will stay with you. Dario, get the secure line. She moved toward the door, then stopped. Lorenzo, she didn't turn around. When this is done, when Strand is taken care of and Voss is finished and the family is stable, you and I will have another conversation about what you owe this family, about what comes next for you. A pause. But not tonight. She walked out. The meeting location Carver selected was a private shipping terminal on the Hudson, 40 minutes south, a facility the Moretti family had controlled through a subsidiary for 11 years, which meant the physical layout was known, the security integration points were established, and the approaches from both water and land could be covered without it being apparent they were covered. Strand's response to Lorenzo's call came in 40 minutes. A voice Serena listened to through the speaker on the secure line. Measured, British-educated, the particular timbre of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that nothing in his voice revealed more than he intended. He agreed to the meeting. 6 in the morning. He wanted Lorenzo present and the documents in hand, and he used the phrase final arrangement in the way people use phrases they've prepared in advance. He was bringing people. That was understood. The question was how many? Serena spent the hours between 1 and 4 in the morning in the security center with Dario and Torres, building a picture. The Strand Operations known personnel roster, pulled from the family's intelligence files and cross-referenced with the identification Reyes's team had run on the man Grant had taken down in the garden. Strand traveled with a core team of 6, former military, 2 different countries of origin, the kind of professional record that appeared only in the spaces between official documentation. He would supplement with local contractors when he needed numbers. He'll bring 12, Dario said. Minimum. We'll have 14 on site, Serena said, plus Lucien. Lucien shouldn't be operational with that shoulder. Tell Lucien that. Dario didn't respond because they both understood that telling Lucien he couldn't participate in the operation that addressed his father's murder and his uncle's betrayal on the same night was not a conversation with a productive outcome. Grant appeared at the security center doorway at 2:30. He'd cleaned up somewhat, borrowed a shirt from somewhere, washed the blood off his hands, though the cut on his forearm had been butterflied closed with medical tape someone had found, and the bruising around it was already going purple. I want to help, he said. Serena looked at him. I mean it. Voss used me for 11 years. I have his full financial architecture in my head. Every entity, every account structure, every professional relationship he used as cover. Whatever you need to build a case that collapses his legal structures before he can shift assets, I can provide it. He paused. And I know his personal schedule, his routines, his vulnerabilities. Another pause. I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you I'm in, if you want me. Serena studied him for a moment. The man she'd married had never once in 8 years offered himself without calculating the return. Not because he was cruel, because it was how he was built, the constant unconscious arithmetic of advantage. And maybe this was still that. Maybe even now he was computing that cooperation was his best available position. But the bruised forearm and the borrowed shirt and the fact that he'd gone out a third-floor window and landed on an armed man in a dark garden suggested that at least some of what was happening in Grant Holloway right now was not arithmetic. Get with Carver, she said. Everything you know about Voss's financial structures. All of it, tonight. We'll file the civil action simultaneously with what happens at the terminal. Hit him from both sides before he knows the terminal operation failed. Grant nodded. He started to say something else. Go, she said. Not unkind, just precise. He went. And the terminal at 5:50 in the morning was the particular gray of pre-dawn on the Hudson. The water moving slow and heavy, the New Jersey skyline a smear of orange and white across the river. Container cranes standing along the waterfront like enormous birds frozen mid-reach. The air smelled of diesel and brine, and the particular cold of October water. Serena stood inside the terminal's main processing building, second level, at a window that gave her a sightline across the entire approach. Below her, on the ground floor, Lorenzo sat at a metal table with a folder of documents, real documents, the succession papers, because she'd decided that having the real thing was better than a copy Strand might authenticate and dismiss. Carver stood behind Lorenzo with his hands clasped behind his back. Dario was on her left. 12 of their team were distributed through the building, positioned at the 4 ground floor entry points, the loading dock, the stairwells, the roof. Lucien was at the north entry point with Reyes and 2 others, shoulder be damned, and Serena had stopped arguing about it 2 hours ago. Torres was in the security van outside the terminal's east fence, with eyes on the approach roads and the river. At 5:58, Torres's voice came through her earpiece. Two vehicles, land approach, South Entry Road. Black, no plates. Moving at... They're stopping. Serena watched the approach road through the window. Headlights, stationary, 300 meters out. He's checking the site, Dario said quietly. He'll have someone on the river too, she said. Torres, eyes on the water. Already looking, Torres said. I've got... Yes, one vessel. Running dark, moving slow. They're paralleling the terminal's south face. Don't touch it yet, Serena said. Wait. The vehicles began moving again. Slow, deliberate, the way vehicles move when the people inside them are watching everything at once. They pulled to the terminal's south vehicle entrance, the only open gate, the one she'd left open, and stopped. 6 men got out of the first vehicle, 5 from the second. 11. One short of Dario's estimate, which was close enough to confirm they'd read the situation accurately. And then the second vehicle's rear door opened again, and a 12th man got out, and this one walked differently than the others. Not with the forward lean of someone prepared for action, but with the upright, unhurried posture of a man who has always had other people prepare the action for him, and sees no reason to change that now. Elliot Strand was taller than his photographs suggested. Narrow through the shoulder, wearing a dark overcoat, his face carrying the kind of weathered intelligence that comes from a life spent managing large and dangerous systems. He stood at the terminal entrance and looked at the building for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, and then he walked in. He's inside, Torres said unnecessarily. Serena was already watching on the internal camera feed. Strand crossing the ground floor toward the table where Lorenzo sat, his men spreading into a loose perimeter behind him, their weapons not drawn, but carried with the readiness of people who intended to draw them at the first relevant stimulus. Strand stopped at the table. He looked at Lorenzo. He looked at Carver. His gaze moved around the room in a professional sweep. Mr. Moretti, he said. His voice carried in the empty building. You look tired. It's been a difficult night, Lorenzo said. For everyone. Strand pulled out the chair across from Lorenzo and sat down with the ease of a man who felt no threat in any room he'd walked into in the last 30 years. The estate operation was messier than I preferred. I apologize for that. These things rarely go cleanly when you accelerate the timeline. Why did you accelerate? Because your niece is more capable than either of us anticipated, Strand said. And capable people, once they have the authority and the motivation, tend to move faster than comfortable. He looked at the folder on the table. The documents? Lorenzo put his hand on the folder. Serena's voice came through the earpiece of every team member in the building. On my mark. Wait for the signal word. The signal word was the last word of the sentence she intended to say to Strand when she stepped into his sightline. She'd chosen it the night before and told it to no one except Dario because the signal word needed to be spoken before he had time to process what was happening, and for that to work, his attention needed to be fully on her. She moved away from the window and down the internal staircase. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. She straightened her jacket. She breathed once, slow and full. Then she pushed through the door and walked across the ground floor toward the table. And Elliot Strand looked up from the folder Lorenzo had just opened, and the two of them saw each other for the first time. His face did something interesting. Not fear, not yet, but a recalibration, the same thing she'd seen on Lorenzo's face the night before. The expression of a man updating a map that has just revealed new terrain. Mr. Strand, she said. Her voice was level and carried. I've read your financial disclosures for the last 4 years. Your declared entities, your offshore structures, the holding companies you use to buffer the operational side from the legitimate side. She stopped 8 feet from the table. You're very good at creating distance between yourself and the things you order done. The question I want to answer for you right now this morning is whether that distance is enough. Strand said nothing. He was very still. The man your team lost in our garden last night, she continued, has been identified. His contract traces to a Strand subsidiary through 2 intermediate entities. The payment structure for Vincent Callow, the man who gave your team the Westport rotation, runs through a Strand account via Hartwell Meridian, which also connects you to the financial infrastructure used to fund the original surveillance of my family's operations. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. The Westport operation, my father's murder, has your signature on it in 4 places. She watched his face. He was good. He didn't move. He didn't reach for anything. He looked at her with the controlled expression of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and has not broken in them. You have none of that in a form that's legally actionable, he said. Not yet, she said, but the civil filing we submitted to the Southern District 40 minutes ago contains the financial forensics that will get us there. She paused. Which means your accounts are about to be frozen in 3 jurisdictions before you leave this building. That landed. Small, just a tightening around the eyes. But it landed. One of his men behind him shifted. Don't, Dario said from behind Serena, and his voice had a quality that made the man stop. Strand said, This is an elaborate piece of theater. It's a conversation, Serena said. The theater is what happens next if you reach for something. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lorenzo. You set me up, he said. Not angry, assessing. He cooperated, Serena said. There's a difference. For a man who betrayed his own family to me, Strand said, he picked an interesting time to develop scruples. For a man who murdered mine, she said, you picked an interesting morning to come in person. His jaw tightened. First real tell. Holloway, he said. The name came out like he'd just understood something. Holloway gave you the Hartwell Meridian trace, among other things. And Voss is having a conversation with federal investigators right now, she said. The civil filing triggered a parallel referral. His asset freeze is hitting at the same time as yours. She paused. You and Voss ran parallel plays. I know you knew about each other. I also know you're going to spend the next 6 months each trying to establish that the other was the primary architect of what happened to my father, because that's how people like you survive. You find someone to be more guilty. She tilted her head slightly. The problem is that the documentation doesn't give either of you that much room. Strand was very quiet. Behind him, his 11 men were standing in various configurations of readiness and uncertainty. They'd come here for a handover, not a confrontation. The geometry of the room had changed under their feet, and they were professionals, and professionals read geometry. What they were reading right now was 12 of them, building full of Moretti security they couldn't fully locate, a woman at a table who hadn't raised her voice once and somehow had more control of this room than their principal. What do you want? Strand said. And there it was. The question that came when a man understood his position. Serena had prepared this answer more carefully than anything else, because this was the answer that would determine what the next year of her life looked like. I want a full accounting, she said. Written, documented, witnessed by Carver. Everyone involved in the operation against my father. Every entity, every instruction, every payment. The complete picture. She let a beat pass. In exchange, my family's legal action targets the organizations, not the individuals, and we cooperate with the federal referral in a way that provides you a clear path to a plea arrangement rather than a trial. She watched him. That's a generous offer, he said carefully. It's not generous, she said. It's efficient. A trial costs me 2 years and costs you more. The accounting gives me what I actually want, which isn't you in prison. It's the complete dismantling of everything you built that touches my family's operations. I want the network gone. You can be somewhere else. Strand looked at the table, at Lorenzo, at Carver, back at her. I need 24 hours, he said. You have 6, she said. Carver will provide you a secure room. Strand's face moved through several things in rapid succession, calculations she could partially read and partially couldn't, the compressed arithmetic of a man who has run out of the kind of room that makes arithmetic easy. Then he nodded. Once, short. Serena turned toward the staircase. She heard Dario moving behind her, heard the controlled activity of the team beginning the process of securing Strand's personnel in the various ways they'd discussed. She heard Lorenzo say something to Carver in a low voice. She heard the river outside, still moving. She put her foot on the first step. Her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. The number was one she didn't recognize, but the area code was one she did. The exchange matched the Upper East Side townhouse where Harlan Voss operated. She answered. Miss Moretti. The voice was not Voss. Younger, precise, with the flat affect of someone reading from a prepared statement. My name is Prescott. I work for Mr. Voss. I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Voss passed away approximately 40 minutes ago at his residence. The cause appears to be cardiac. The relevant parties have been notified, and I've been instructed to convey that Mr. Voss's estate will be fully cooperative with any legal proceedings initiated by your family. Serena stood on the first step of the staircase and said nothing for a moment. Cardiac, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Dario, who had come up beside her and was listening to the call. His face showed nothing. Thank you, Prescott, she said, and ended the call. She and Dario stood in the stairwell for a moment in the relative quiet. Cardiac, Dario said. Apparently. He was 71. He was. A pause. Do you believe it? Dario asked. Serena looked at the phone in her hand, at the dark screen, at her own reflection in it, pale and tired and still standing. I believe it doesn't change what needs to happen with Strand, she said. And I believe the federal referral proceeds regardless. She pocketed the phone. And I believe that somewhere in the last 6 hours, someone decided that Harlan Voss was a liability that needed to be resolved before we resolved it for them. Which means there's a fourth player, Dario said quietly. Serena had already thought of this, had been thinking of it in the back of her mind since the garden, since the moment she'd counted the angles and found one more than she could account for. Voss. Strand, Lorenzo. 3 players, 3 separate agendas, all converging on the same family at the same time, which was either extraordinary coincidence or orchestration, and Serena Moretti did not believe in extraordinary coincidence. Someone had wound them all up and pointed them in the same direction. Someone who had wanted the Moretti family dismantled so thoroughly that they'd used 3 separate instruments to ensure no single failure could save it. Someone who was not Voss, not Strand, not a frightened old man in a wool cardigan. Someone still out there. Someone who, right now, was receiving reports that the night had not gone according to plan, that the estate still stood, that Strand was in custody, that Voss was dead, and was deciding, in whatever room they occupied, what to do next. Serena's hand closed around the phone in her pocket. She thought about her father's face on the runway, the way he'd held her face in his hands, the expression she'd misread as joy. He'd known there was a fourth player. That was what the expression had been. Not joy, not grief. The particular anguish of a man who knows something is coming and cannot stop it and cannot tell you, because telling you would put you in the path of it before you were ready. He'd known, and he'd changed the succession to her, not because Lucien was weak, not entirely, but because he'd understood that whatever was coming required something Lucien didn't have and Serena did. The 8 years she'd spent outside this world hadn't diminished her. They'd built something in her, a kind of patience, a kind of invisibility, a capacity to exist in the spaces between power without being consumed by them. That was exactly the instrument this moment required. Her father had known, and he'd trusted her with it. Serena Moretti stood in the stairwell of a shipping terminal on the Hudson with a phone in her pocket and a war half won, and somewhere out there, a fourth player who had orchestrated the deaths of everyone she'd mourned in the last 10 days, and she felt the full weight of it settle into her chest, not breaking her, not crushing her, but changing her, the way weight changes the thing it presses against, reshaping it into something that can hold more. She put her foot on the next step. Find out who called it in, she said to Dario. Voss's death. Find out who knew about it before the EMTs arrived. She moved up the stairs. Because someone in that building was waiting for it to happen. She was halfway up when Lucien's voice came through her earpiece. Strained at the edges, tight with effort, and something else, something she couldn't immediately identify. Serena, he said, you need to come to the north entry, right now. What is it? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be alarming. Lorenzo, Lucien said. He's gone. Serena stopped moving. What do you mean, gone? I mean, he walked out of the terminal during the Strand handover and no one has eyes on him. Another pause. And the Northgate camera just picked up a vehicle, different from the one Strand came in, older, parked on the service road since before we arrived. Lucian's voice dropped. Someone brought a car for him, Serena. Someone knew he'd need a way out. She stood on the stairs. The fourth player, Lorenzo Moretti, who had cooperated, who had made the call to Strand, who had sat in the chair with his grief that looked real, and probably was real. But grief and loyalty were not the same thing, and she had known that, and she had used him, and in using him she had perhaps underestimated the depth of the arrangement he was already in. Not 3 players pointed at the family. 4. And the fourth one had been at her dinner table since she was born. She ran. The service road ran north along the terminal's perimeter fence before bending west toward the access highway, and the vehicle Lucien had spotted on the North Gate camera, a dark green sedan, older, the kind of car that didn't attract attention in any city in the country, was already moving when Serena came through the north exit at a run. Dario was 3 steps behind her. Reyes and one other were already at the perimeter gate, and Reyes had the gate open because Reyes was the kind of person who anticipated the next instruction by about 4 seconds, which was why Serena had put her where she was. The sedan was 200 meters out and accelerating. Serena looked at the vehicles they had. The security van Torres had been running surveillance from was parked 60 meters south of the gate. She changed direction without breaking stride, hit the van's passenger door, and pulled it open. Torres looked at her from the driver's seat. "Drive," she said. Torres drove. They came out of the terminal gate with the wheels on the gravel shoulder because Torres took the turn fast and the road was narrow, and the sedan's taillights were visible ahead. Red in the gray morning, moving at speed, but not at the speed of a vehicle whose driver believed he was being followed yet. Lorenzo didn't know she'd seen the camera footage, didn't know Lucian had flagged the car. He thought he'd walked out clean during the controlled chaos of the Strand handover, and for approximately 3 minutes, he had been right. "Don't get close enough to spook him," Serena said. "I want to know where he's going." Torres kept 200 meters back. The access highway was 600 meters ahead, and if Lorenzo reached it and chose north, he was heading for the city. If he chose south, he was heading for the private airstrip in Elizabeth that the family had used for decades, and that Lorenzo knew as well as anyone. He chose south. Serena's phone was already out. She called Dario, still at the terminal, managing Strand's containment. "Elizabeth airstrip," she said. "Get someone there ahead of us." "It'll be tight." "Do it." She ended the call and watched the road and thought about her uncle and tried to build the shape of it cleanly because she needed the shape before she arrived, needed to understand what she was walking into. Lorenzo had not simply panicked and run. The car had been pre-positioned. Someone had known the meeting at the terminal might end with Lorenzo's leverage expended and his freedom limited, and had arranged an exit before the meeting began. That meant Lorenzo had communicated with the fourth player after his conversation with Serena at the estate. During the hours of preparation, while Carver was drafting cooperation documents and Dario was building the terminal operation, Lorenzo had found a way to signal someone. The phone Carver had given him for the call to Strand. She'd had Carver monitor outgoing calls. She'd thought she was being thorough. She hadn't thought about incoming. Someone had called him on that phone, given him instructions, told him when to move and what to do and where the car would be. And then that someone had gone quiet, because that was what a fourth player did. They stayed behind the instruments and let the instruments exhaust themselves and waited for the wreckage to settle. The airstrip appeared on the left, a private facility, 2 runways, a single terminal building with the lights on inside. A small jet was on the tarmac with its engines already turning, navigation lights blinking against the pale morning sky. Lorenzo's sedan pulled through the access gate. Torres pulled to the shoulder 200 meters back. Serena was out of the van before it fully stopped. She didn't run this time. She walked, deliberately, at a pace that communicated she was not rushing because she didn't need to rush, because the geometry was already resolved and Lorenzo hadn't understood it yet. She came through the access gate, unlocked, which confirmed the fourth player had resources inside this facility or connected to it, and crossed the tarmac toward the jet. Lorenzo was at the foot of the jet's steps when he heard her footsteps on the tarmac and turned. His face when he saw her was, she filed it away later, as one of the most honest things she'd ever seen on a human face. Not surprise exactly, more like the specific anguish of a man who had been hoping, against the evidence, that he might be wrong about how well she understood the situation. He wasn't wrong about her. He'd just been hoping. "Serena," he said. She stopped 6 feet from him. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and stood in the October morning with the jet engines turning behind him and looked at her father's brother and waited. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "You had several choices," she said. "You made this one repeatedly, over a long period of time, which is different from not having one. You don't understand how long this has been." "Tell me," she said. "Right now, everything. Who is on that jet?" He looked at her. Then he looked past her, at the fence line, at the access road, at the empty tarmac, with the expression of a man calculating distances and options and finding them insufficient. "His name is Kavanaugh," Lorenzo said. "Richard Kavanaugh. He's been the silent architecture behind everything for 15 years. Not Voss, not Strand. They were both working for Kavanaugh without fully knowing it. He creates the instruments. He funds them through structures so layered that even the instruments can't trace back to him. He identifies targets, families, organizations, asset bases, and he builds the case for their acquisition over years. Patient. Lorenzo's voice was tired in a way that went deeper than one night. He identified the Moretti port assets 12 years ago, built Voss's acquisition strategy, funded Strand's operational capability, used me to provide the internal intelligence that made both of them viable. "And my father?" Lorenzo was quiet. "Dad knew," Serena said. It wasn't a question. She'd had enough time on the drive to arrive at it. "He knew about Kavanaugh. That's why he changed the succession, not just because of the syndicate pressure, because he knew there was something behind it that required a different kind of response. He suspected," Lorenzo said carefully. "He didn't have the full picture, but he'd identified anomalies in the way the rival operations were coordinating, said, too consistent, too patient, too well-funded for organizations that were theoretically competing with each other. He was getting close." A pause. Kavanaugh decided he couldn't wait anymore. "So you told Kavanaugh my father was getting close." The silence Lorenzo produced was its own answer. "How long?" she said. 12 years? 12 years. Serena held that. Her father's brother, at every table, at every family event, in every room where sensitive information was discussed, for 12 years. "The jet," she said. "Where's Kavanaugh now?" "I don't know." "Lorenzo, I genuinely don't know where he is physically. He doesn't share that. He contacts me. I don't contact him." He looked at her. "The jet is one of his aircraft. Someone from his organization is on it. They were supposed to bring me to a handover location." He stopped. "I don't know where." Serena turned and looked at the jet. The steps were still down. The engines were turning. No one had come out, which meant whoever was on the jet was waiting, and waiting meant they were watching, and watching meant they had already assessed that the situation on the tarmac had not gone according to plan. "How does he contact you?" she said. "A phone changed every month." "Where is it?" Lorenzo reached into his cardigan pocket and held out a phone. A basic model, nothing distinctive. She took it. She looked at the call log. "One incoming call, 40 minutes ago. Duration 47 seconds. The number was masked. She looked at the jet. "Tell them it's clear," she said. "Tell them you got out clean and you're ready to board." Lorenzo stared at her. "I can't." "You can." She held the phone out to him. "Call them back on whatever channel they gave you. Tell them it worked. Tell them I don't know you're gone yet." She kept her eyes on him. "You owe this family a debt you will never finish paying. Start here." Lorenzo took the phone. His hands were not steady. He was 70 years old and he hadn't slept, and whatever ideology or resentment or fear had sustained him through 12 years of this was no longer sufficient to hold him upright, and Serena could see it in him the way you see a structure fail, not all at once, but at the load-bearing points, one after another. He made the call. She listened. His voice was controlled. He said what she'd told him to say and added nothing, and the person on the other end, a voice she could partially hear, male, clipped, said 2 words and ended the call. "He's sending someone down," Lorenzo said. "Good," she said. "Step back." He stepped back. The jet door opened fully a moment later, and a man appeared at the top of the steps. 40s, dark jacket, the careful posture of someone who was armed and knew how to be, and he came down the steps and stopped at the bottom when he saw that the tarmac contained Serena Moretti and not just Lorenzo, and his hand moved toward his jacket. Reyes stepped out from behind the jet's front landing gear where she'd been standing for the last 90 seconds with her weapon already up. "Don't," Reyes said. The man from the jet assessed the geometry and made the correct decision and put his hands up. His name was Forsyth, and he had been Richard Kavanaugh's personal logistics coordinator for 6 years, and he had the particular misfortune of being, among everything else he was, a meticulous record keeper. Carver spent 4 hours with the contents of Forsyth's phone and the encrypted tablet he'd been carrying and the documents that Serena's team extracted from the jet's onboard safe. And at the end of those 4 hours, he came to the room where Serena was sitting with cold coffee and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been awake for 26 hours navigating the end of the world. And he set a folder on the table in front of her. "Kavanaugh's full operational architecture," Carver said. 12 years of it. Entity structures, funding flows, communication records, the full scope of his involvement in the Moretti operation and 4 others. He paused. "He's been doing this to other families. We're not the only target." "Who else?" 2 European shipping concerns and a South American agricultural conglomerate. Same method. Patient destabilization, multiple instruments, acquisition at collapse. Carver's voice was as flat and precise as always, but beneath it something moved that she recognized as controlled fury. "He's very good at it." "Where is he?" "That," Carver said, "is the question." Forsyth had not known Kavanaugh's location. The communication structures were designed so that no single person below the top of the organization could trace back to the source. Kavanaugh contacted down, never up, and changed his physical location on a schedule only he controlled. But the financial architecture Forsyth had been maintaining was traceable in ways that personal location wasn't, and Carver had already been on the phone with 2 federal jurisdictions and a contact in the International Financial Crimes Unit whose name Serena didn't ask about. "The federal referral on Voss," Serena said. "Can it be expanded to include Kavanaugh's network?" "Already done," Carver said. "The documentation from Forsyth's tablet is being transmitted now." He looked at her over his glasses. "His asset freeze will begin within 6 hours. All declared entities. The undeclared ones will take longer, but the declared base alone represents enough exposure to make his position untenable." "He'll run." "He's already running," Carver said. "Has been since Voss died, I suspect." Voss's death wasn't cardiac, by the way. The medical examiner's preliminary finding is consistent with rapid-acting cardiotoxic exposure. Someone got to him before we did. Serena absorbed this. "Kavanaugh cleaned house," she said. "Voss was the most traceable connection between Kavanaugh and the Moretti operation." "Yes." "Which means Kavanaugh knew last night's operation failed, knew Strand was in our custody, and decided Voss was a liability before we could turn him." She looked at the folder. "He's methodical. Even in retreat, he's methodical." "Methodical people leave methodical trails," Carver said. "The financial forensics team will find him. It will take time." "How much time?" "Months," Carver said. "Possibly longer." Serena nodded slowly. She picked up the coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. "Then we wait," she said. "And we make sure everything we've built in the meantime is solid enough that when they find him, the case doesn't need us to be anything other than what we are." She looked at Carver. "What does solid look like from here?" Carver sat down across from her for the first time in the entire conversation, which told her he understood this was a different kind of discussion than the operational ones they'd been having. "It looks like a legitimate business," he said carefully. "The port terminal network, the shipping operations, the private equity holdings, all of it brought into full legal compliance, managed by boards with traceable governance, subject to standard regulatory oversight. He folded his hands. Your father built something that was valuable underneath everything else it was. The infrastructure, the relationships, the asset base. These are real, and they're substantial, and they don't require the other architecture to function. You're telling me the criminal operation is the part that goes. I'm telling you it's the part that was always the liability, Carver said. It's what made you a target. It's what gave Kavanaugh and Voss and Strand their argument for why acquiring you was preferable to competing with you. He paused. Remove it, and you become something they can't justify moving against. You become simply a very large, very well-capitalized international business with excellent legal representation. Serena looked at her hands on the table, the tiredness in them, the steadiness in them, which surprised her slightly, even now. Lucien, she said. We'll need to be part of this conversation, Carver agreed. His role, going forward, what he wants, what's possible. And Lorenzo? Carver was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is yours to decide. She had the conversation with Lucien in the estate's kitchen at 7 in the evening, because the kitchen was the room in the house where serious things had always eventually come to rest. Not the study, not the formal rooms, but here, under the fluorescent light, with the old wooden table and the smell of coffee that had been brewing in this room for 60 years of family history. Lucien sat across from her with his shoulder in a proper sling now. The field bandage replaced hours ago by an actual physician who had arrived without being asked because Dario ran a tight operation. He looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together slightly wrong, which was probably accurate. He poured coffee for both of them without asking. Old habit. He'd been doing it since they were teenagers. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. I'm thinking we legitimize everything, she said. Full restructure, legal compliance across every entity. The operations that can't survive that restructure we wind down cleanly. She wrapped her hands around the mug. I want to build something that doesn't require us to live the way Dad lived, looking over our shoulders at the thing that's coming. Lucien was quiet for a moment. He didn't mind it, Lucien said, the looking over his shoulder. I think he thought it was just the cost, the thing you paid for what you had. And what did it buy him? A long silence. Not enough, Lucien said. She looked at her brother, the set of his jaw, the tiredness around his eyes, the specific grief of a person who has lost a parent and a mentor in the same week and discovered that one of them was not what he appeared. She thought about the nod he'd given her when Lorenzo was sitting in the study, the way he'd made room for her authority in that moment without making a production of it, the way he'd been in that garden, wounded, alone, doing what needed to be done. I need you in this, she said, not underneath me, alongside the operational side, the relationships, the things you've built. I need that. You're asking me if I'm in. I'm telling you I want you in. Those are different things. She met his eyes. You get to decide. Lucien looked at his coffee. He turned the mug in his hands once, a slow rotation, looking at it like it contained something he was trying to read. Yeah, he said. I'm in. She nodded. They sat in the kitchen for a while and didn't say much, and the quiet between them was the kind that two people earn by surviving the same thing from different sides. Yeah. Grant came to see her 2 days later. She was in the estate's east garden. The damage from the assault had been cleared, the broken window above replaced, the stone pathways cleaned. Sitting on a bench with a legal brief Carver had sent over, working through it with a pen. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October day that made the air feel like something being rinsed clean. Grant walked across the garden without a guard escort, which meant Dario had cleared him at the gate and decided she could handle it without backup, which she appreciated. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the garden and then at her. How's the shoulder? He said, meaning Lucien. Healing, she said. And you? She considered the question with the seriousness it probably deserved. Working, she said. He sat down on the bench, not beside her but at the far end, with enough space between them that it was a deliberate acknowledgement of where things stood. The federal cooperation agreement went through, he said. Marcus finalized it this morning. I've got immunity for the financial documentation I provided on Voss's network. A pause. I'll testify if they need me to. I know, she said. Carver told me. The firm it's not salvageable. he said, not asking for sympathy, just stating a fact in the way he'd learned to state facts since none of them had been working in his favor. The intellectual property findings, the reputational exposure from the Voss connection, there's no version of it that survives. I'm dissolving it. What will you do? He looked at the garden, at the hedgerows, the stone paths, the October light filtering through the trees at the far edge. I don't know, he said. First thing I've genuinely not known in a long time. He paused. It turns out not knowing is uncomfortable in a way I didn't fully understand until I had no way to avoid it. Yes, she said. He looked at her. I spent 8 years looking at you and not seeing you, he said. Not performing remorse, just delivering a fact he'd arrived at slowly and was still arriving at. I don't expect you to tell me that's all right. I know it isn't. He stopped. I just wanted to say it to your face. Serena set the legal brief down on the bench beside her. Grant, she said, you testified. You gave us Voss's financial architecture, which gave us Forsyth, which gave us Kavanaugh's network. That matters. She looked at him steadily. That doesn't make the 8 years something different than what they were, but it means something about who you are when the options narrow down to what's actually true. She paused. Most people don't make that choice. They find something easier. He said nothing for a moment. Camille left, he said. Not as a bid for sympathy, more like information he was still processing. When the firm started collapsing, she left the way people leave when the thing they were attached to is the circumstance rather than the person. I know what that feels like, Serena said. He almost smiled, didn't quite. Yeah, I guess you do. They sat in the garden for a few more minutes without talking, and then Grant stood, and they said goodbye in the way people say goodbye when they've been through something together and both understand that what they've been through doesn't create the kind of closeness that invites staying. She watched him cross the garden and disappear around the east corner of the house. She picked up the legal brief and continued reading. Lorenzo stood before her in the study 3 days after that, with Carver present and Dario by the door, and she told him what she'd decided. You'll provide complete testimony to the federal investigation, she said. Everything about Kavanaugh, every communication, every instruction, every piece of intelligence you passed to him over 12 years. Carver will be present for all of it. She set her hands flat on the desk. In exchange, the family will not pursue independent civil action against you. We'll cooperate with whatever plea arrangement the federal authorities offer. Lorenzo stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her. And after? He said. After, she said, you go somewhere else. You don't come back to any property this family owns. You don't contact Lucien or anyone on our staff. You live whatever life that remains to you. She paused. That's the offer. It doesn't improve. He was quiet for a long time. You know why I did it, he said. Not defending, just wanting her to know he knew she understood. I know you love this family in the way that people love things they want to control, she said. I know you spent 30 years believing that Lucien's leadership meant your influence, and that my return ended that. I know you were afraid. She held his gaze. None of that changes what it cost us. He nodded. One slow movement. No, he said. I didn't think it would. He testified for 11 days across 2 federal jurisdictions, and the account he gave was meticulous and complete, and, as far as Carver could verify against the Forsyth documentation, accurate in every detail. It was, in its way, the most useful thing Lorenzo Moretti had done for the family in a decade. When it was finished, he got into a car that Carver had arranged. Not a family vehicle, just a car. And he left. And Serena watched through the estate window as the car went down the gravel drive and through the gate and out into the road that led south toward the city. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not grief exactly. Something closer to the specific exhaustion that follows a long illness. Not the illness itself, but the recovery, which has its own weight and its own duration. She turned away from the window. Richard Kavanaugh was located 4 months later in a private property in coastal Portugal, operating under a name he'd been using for 6 years, which was 3 years longer than the federal investigators had initially thought to look. The asset freeze had hit him before he'd finished moving everything. The methodical man, in his methodical retreat, had underestimated the speed with which Forsyth's records would produce actionable financial intelligence. And that underestimation had frozen $2 billion in declared assets before he could shift them. The extradition took another 8 months. Serena was not in the courtroom when Kavanaugh was arraigned. She watched the news coverage on a laptop in her office. A real office now, in the legitimate holding company that had absorbed the Moretti asset base under its new legal structure, on the 32nd floor of a midtown building with her name on the corporate registration. The coverage showed a man in his mid-60s, silver-haired, the kind of unremarkable face that had probably been useful to him over the years. He walked into the courtroom with his attorneys and sat down and looked straight ahead, and the camera caught him in profile for a moment, and Serena studied his face and found nothing she didn't already know. She closed the laptop. There was work to do. The restructure took 14 months from start to completion, or the version of completion that a business of that complexity could achieve, which was less an ending than the establishment of a sustainable new normal. 3 operating divisions: port and terminal logistics under Lucian's direct oversight, a private equity arm managed by a board Carver had assembled with the care of someone who understood that every member was a statement about what the organization intended to be, and an international trade consultancy that Serena ran herself, and that was, quietly, the most profitable of the 3. The criminal operations were wound down the way Carver had described, cleanly, carefully, in a sequence that managed the human and financial consequences of extraction without pretending there were no consequences. Some of the people who'd operated inside that structure found places within the legitimate business. Others didn't, and Serena didn't pretend she could control all of those outcomes, but she made sure the transition was handled with more care than it might have been. Lucian healed. Not just the shoulder, everything. It was slow and it was not linear, and there were weeks when she could see it in him, the weight of what had happened to their father and what Lorenzo had been, sitting on him in a way that didn't lift so much as redistribute. But he kept showing up. Every morning, in the office, in the terminal operations, in the work. Kept doing the next thing. That was, Serena thought, the most honest form of resilience. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that just keeps getting up and doing the next thing. She visited her father's grave once a month. Not to speak to him. She didn't believe in speaking to the dead. She went because it was the place where she could think most clearly about what she was doing and why, and because standing there with the wind off the Hudson on a cold morning made her aware of the particular privilege of being alive and having things to do. She thought about him often, not with the raw grief of the first months, but with the more complicated texture of someone trying to understand a person who loved them completely and imperfectly, and had made decisions that bore consequences that outlasted him. She understood the succession change differently now than she had on the night Lucian had told her about it. It hadn't been entirely about capability. It had been about what he needed her to become, had always suspected she could become, even through the 8 years of silence and distance and the ordinary life she'd tried to build from nothing. He'd believed she would come back to herself when she needed to. He'd been right, and she wasn't sure whether to be grateful for that or angry about it, and she'd mostly landed on the conclusion that both things could be true simultaneously and that this was simply the nature of loving someone who was also complicated. The gold-plated jet was decommissioned 8 months into the restructure. Serena's decision. Not symbolic. Practical. The maintenance cost was obscene, and the statement it made about the organization was one she no longer wanted to make. It was replaced by 2 standard configuration aircraft that served the business's travel needs without announcing them. She flew commercial when she could. It was, she'd decided, a useful discipline. The line at security, the gate delays, the particular democracy of it, people from everywhere going somewhere, all of them carrying whatever they were carrying, all of them waiting the same way. She was at JFK in November, a year and 2 months after the courthouse, waiting for a flight to Rotterdam for a port infrastructure conference, sitting in the terminal with a coffee and a document she was reading when her phone rang. The number was Grant's. She answered. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that the federal sentencing on the Voss network came through. The 3 principals got 15, 12, and 8. Kavanaugh's sentencing is scheduled for March. I know, she said. Carver sent me the filing. Right. A pause. I also wanted to tell you that I started something. Small. A boutique advisory practice. Just me and 2 analysts. Another pause. I'm doing it clean this time. Entirely original work. Nobody's ideas but the people in the room. Good, she said. It's going okay, he said. It's slower than before. But it feels different. Doing something that's actually mine. She thought about what to say to that. Thought about 8 years in a leather notebook and the third drawer of a desk and all the ways that a person can be in front of another person and remain entirely invisible. It should feel different, she said. That's how you know it's real. A long pause. Serena, he said, I know that what I'm about to say I know it doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that the work you did, the thinking that I took without knowing I was taking it, I want you to know that I know now what it was worth, what you were worth. His voice was careful and tired and honest. I should have known then. I didn't. I'm sorry. She sat in the airport terminal with the coffee going warm in her hand and the announcement board cycling through departures and the noise of 1,000 people going somewhere. I know, she said. She meant it as acceptance, not absolution. He would understand the difference. He was learning the difference between those things. Take care of yourself, Grant, she said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and the document on her knee and the terminal moving around her in its ordinary urgent way. Then she picked up the document and found her place and kept reading, because the Rotterdam conference was in 2 days and the agenda had 5 items she needed to be prepared for, and the world did not pause for the completion of one chapter before the next one opened. Her flight was called 40 minutes later. She gathered her bag and her document and her coffee and joined the line moving toward the gate. One person among hundreds, nothing about her announcing what she'd been through or what she'd built or what she intended to build next. That was, she'd decided exactly right. The woman everyone had underestimated had spent a year proving what she was. Now she was done proving it. Now she was simply doing it, which was the part that mattered, and the part that would last, and the part that required nothing from anyone else. No witness, no acknowledgement, no courtroom full of people watching the moment when she stopped being what they'd decided she was. She handed her boarding pass to the agent at the gate. She walked down the jetway toward whatever came next. Behind her, the terminal carried on, loud and indifferent and entirely unaware. The way the world always is, until it isn't.